the title of my presentation is The Chainsaw as a Tool for Critical Thought. And that encompasses experimental education in wildland fire management in Baja California, Mexico. So to set the stage for what we're going to be hearing about today, we're going to take a little trip to Baja and to the Parque Nacional Sierra de San Pedro Martir. So some of you may be familiar with this area, some of you may not, but to give you some basics, it's administered by an organization called CONAP, which is the Mexican equivalent of our National Park Service. So similar type of government agency. The park was established in 1947, but as you'll soon learn, there's a lot of natural history and a lot of preservation of that area that has occurred for as long as the world has existed as a result of just that area being sparsely populated. So the size of the park is over 72,000 hectares. So that's pretty big especially for Baja, and a lot of people don't realize that the park is down there. You can see this picture here in the bottom corner, but there's some pretty interesting topography there. So the elevation in the park ranges from 600 meters to over 3,000 meters. So, you know, if you think about that in terms of what we're used to here in Flagstaff, that would be as if you had Phoenix and then the top of Mount Eldon kind of all right there next to each other. And so it's pretty impressive in what that does for the climate of the park and the vegetation types. So at the very lower elevations, you have Sonoran Desert, and then all the way up to California mixed conifer forests, which a lot of people are like, Baja California, there's big trees there? Well, there is. And you know, you can see that contrast in this picture here. This out here is the plateau that dips off into the Sea of Cortez. And then you're up here at 10,000 feet elevation up in the trees. So it's a pretty dramatic landscape. It's very important to the people of Baja California. And it's located at the southernmost edge of what's known as the North American Mediterranean climate zone. So, okay, so that kind of sets the stage for where we are. So now let's talk about why this place is important to me and to a lot of other people, and how all of this came to be. So it all started myself and a few other wildland firefighters on our off time. We do what wildland firefighters often do in the winter, and that's go and try not to think about work and go somewhere warm, or so we thought, somewhere warm. And so we got in a car with some dogs and we drove down to Baja California, and we decided we were going to hike a mountain called Picacho del Diablo, which is the highest point. That's that peak that's over 10,000 feet in elevation in the park. And so we arrived equipped with this very detailed, handy map here. You can see that it contains everything necessary that you guys might need to climb a mountain and find your way there. So despite the fact that we had this amazing map and a really strong plan, we actually never found Picacho del Diablo. But as a consolation prize, we did meet a man named Felipe. And Felipe is one of the park rangers at Sierra San Pedro. And we started a dialogue with him, and he had some really, really interesting notes to share with us. And, you know, we kind of made the connection because all the park rangers down there are the ones that do the wildland firefighting. And so we kind of, you know, shared some fire stories, and he showed us his cache and all of his tools. And then we got started talking on some of the challenges that are faced by the park, by the staff, and in resource management. And this is just one example, but you can see there's this giant, nasty, dead tree that's hanging right over the main gazebo there in the park reception area. So that's when all of the 20,000 park visitors a year, this is where they come and hang out underneath that giant dead tree. So, so after that initial conversation, you know, it started me thinking about, okay, these guys have some problems here, have some things that they're struggling with that, you know, they have the motivation to find answers to, but they don't have the resources. And so I kept in touch with Felipe and we exchanged a bunch of emails, and we decided that there's something that we could do that I could do as a wildland fire manager here in the US to help the park. And so we started down the road of, okay, let's create a partnership. We want to figure out how we can go down there, myself and other wildland firefighters, and help the park to address some of these challenges that they face. So in forging that partnership, I realized that it was a little bit longer of a road than I initially thought, which for those of you that know me, that's pretty constant thing. I take on these challenges and then I realize how much is involved in it. But in this particular case, you know, I rose to the occasion and I had a lot of help from other folks. And so we started down this road. And so the first thing that we realized we needed to do was actually identify what problems or what challenges, you know, what were the actual issues that we needed to start devoting our mental and our physical energy into solving at the park and working with Felipe and friends. And so that took us to identify, first off, as you saw in that last slide, hazard tree mitigation. So this is one of my favorite pictures, but you guys can see right here, this is a pooper. And right underneath this nasty tree, and my brother and I were walking around and marveling about what a magnificent end that would be to be sitting on the pooper and just you wouldn't even have to get buried. You'd already be underground. So that was, you know, first and foremost, that was the biggest thing that was visible to us. But the more investigation we did, the more we realized that it wasn't just the hazard trees that were the needs at the park. We also realized that there was a big need for knowledge and for skills in prescribed fire prep. And so to kind of give you the background on that, so Sierra de San Pedro Martir is very unique in that it's used as a reference stand for a lot of fire ecologists. People who want to see what a mostly intact fire regime looks like have done a lot of research down here. And the reason is because there haven't been people around to fight the fires. There hasn't been this massive body of individuals out there like we have had in the US to go out there and stamp out every single fire. And so you've had fires that have continually moved in the way that they historically would have. And so that has created an ecosystem that's a lot different from some of the things that you might see with the northern neighbors up in the US state of California. There's also, you know, there hasn't been a lot of grazing until recently in the park. And uniquely too, there hasn't been any logging in the park. And we'll kind of go into that in a minute. But all these conditions created this really awesome reference stand that is now in a situation where it could be compromised, because now we have a lot more park visitors, we have different uses, and so they can't quite let fires burn maybe as they used to. And so now they're at the point that if they want to continue this heritage of fire on the landscape, they need to start doing prescribed fire. And so, you know, we soon learned that they didn't have any experience with prescribed fire because of this heritage. And so that was a way that, you know, that we thought that we could help them sort of come into the reality of the present conditions. And then finally, the big piece that kind of tied everything together was just lack of opportunity for formal training in firefighting skills and fire management in general. You know, as firefighters here in the U.S., we kind of take it for granted. It's like training is crammed down your throat. It's like every step you take, you have to take another training, and people are just, you know, they're like, oh, I have to go to this different class down at the fire academy. In Mexico, they don't have the same system that's available to them. And so there's not a lot of opportunities for these formalized training. So given all these challenges together, we started to figure out, okay, how can we address all of these together in one fell swoop? And so we realized that there was an opportunity here to feed two birds with one seed. And so the way we would do that was by designing a skills training for the park staff while also accomplishing some of these resource management objectives at the same time. And so now that we had this idea, we figured out what problems we're going to address and how. Now came the reality of my favorite part of working for the government is navigating policy and politics. And that was, I will have to say, it was a humbling experience for me. And I came into it somewhat naive. So the first thing was just gaining awareness of the current international relationships that already existed. I guess in my mind, I thought, okay, you know, I've talked to these guys down there and we can make something happen. And thanks so much to the fact that in my office in Durango, there happens to be a woman by the name of Jaylene Vera who works with the Forest Service international programs. And she kind of told me about this whole network that's already in place that does work with Mexican land management organizations. And that was great because, you know, I definitely didn't want to ruffle any feathers. And so she plugged me in with those folks, and I got to reconnect with an old friend of mine from Conservation Corps days, Rachel Sheridan, who was a master's student with Pete here at NAU, and she's now the director for the Forest Service International Program in Mexico. So that was great to make that reconnection and start to realize, you know, that there's a way that we could do this work without kind of stepping on any toes. So we didn't want to run in there like Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa and start a revolution. We wanted to work within this existing framework and, you know, make sure that we were keeping everybody in the loop and providing a good product that might be something that we continue in the future. So the next thing that we ran into was this amazingly awesome law that exists in Baja California that prohibits anyone from cutting any of the mixed conifer species that grow in the park. And so, you know, I have never really been privy to such a set of conditions here in the US. Pretty much anywhere you go, even in national parks, there's been areas where trees have been cut. But they have this religious ethic that surrounds the preservation of these trees. And so there's this 77-page document that my fledgling Spanish couldn't even begin to uncover. But this document just covers the level of protection that extends to all of these trees. So it doesn't matter whether it's a 50-inch DBH Jeffrey pine or a 2-inch DBH white fir. They're all protected, and to cut it is a crime that's punishable by imprisonment there. So that was a piece of a law that I had to kind of navigate as we decided how we were going to help these folks mitigate some of the problems that they were having with the hazard trees in the park. Another big thing that I went in there kind of naive about is that, it's just me and some bros just going down there and some sisses, going down there to Mexico and we don't really have an organization. We're not going down there officially through the U.S. Forest Service. We don't have a nonprofit or anything. And so we're just people down there in Mexico. And so although the folks at the park were really excited about us coming down there, it definitely created a few challenges without having a formal organization that we were representing. So when they went to write all the documentation and get funding for the event, not having an organization definitely took some finagling. So, and then finally was overcoming language barriers and cultural differences. So I soon realized the people of Baja California are amazingly generous people, and in some cases they're so nice and they're so generous that I soon realized even if I was asking for too much, they might not tell me that. They might put in everything they could to try to scrounge up money and resources to do something, even if it wasn't necessarily the most feasible thing. So that was a learning process, going through all of that and figuring out what I should ask for and how I should ask for it, and just being able to communicate effectively with those folks. So once we got through that, next came for me the fun part. As more of a field guy, I was ready to get in there and find the people. So we had to gather our support, our resources, and our way of actually making this thing happen. So with our feeding two birds with one seed model, we decided, okay, so we're going to put on a training and we're going to teach these folks about fire management and about chainsaws and about cutting trees. But who are we going to teach? So that was the easy part. There was this thing called the brigade that is sort of like an equivalent of AmeriCorps or Conservation Corps programs that we have up here. And that's the funding, that's the way they were able to use their funding to actually employ people for wildland firefighting. So the majority of the folks that attended our training were these guys from the brigade. But it wasn't just them. All of a sudden these folks heard that we were putting on this training, and there was people from there. We had a couple college professors from the university in Baja, or in Ensenada. We had a couple of folks from a local nonprofit, a couple young women who came from that nonprofit. We had some of the local park rangers. We had some government representatives, and it was a really diverse group of folks. And got to the point where we had to put limit on the numbers because everyone was so excited about this opportunity. So we had the people. So the next step was finding the instructors, the folks that wanted to come down and share the knowledge that we have gained up here with this incredibly developed system of wildland fire management. And that also was pretty easy. I was able to reach out to a bunch of folks that I had worked with in the past, and everyone was excited to give their time and come down. So we got the two easy parts out of the way. Now we got to the hard part, and that's the equipment. So as you can imagine, there's not a lot of funding down there. Their program isn't quite as developed. And so, we had to figure out a way to get all the equipment that we need to put on this training. So in addition to those chainsaws that you can see there, you might also notice that there's one pair of chainsaw chaps up here, and that's all that the park had. So we slowly had to overcome those little hurdles, and we are very thankful to Terra Peninsular, which is one of the organizations that helps to support the park, because they have no way of accepting any kind of donations. So, up here we have National Park Foundation type organizations that you can donate to collect money. But down there, they really don't have that infrastructure set up. And so there's Terra Peninsular and one other organization that generally help out with some of the funding for parks. So then once we got our support, our resources, and our people, then we moved on to, okay, what's our course actually going to look like? What are we going to do when we're out there on the ground? So the first thing we did is we wanted to make this thing very holistic. And the way we did that was we designed the course as you might see a wildland firefighting crew here in the US set up. So the whole course was in the model of a crew, like a 20-person hotshot crew or hand crew. And then within that crew, we broke up into 2 squads. And so that kind of gave us a little bit better of span of control when we actually went out to do our cutting and to do our training. And then within that, we broke folks up into these pairs or SAW teams. And that allowed people to get used to working with another individual when they're cutting, be it on the fire line or in a hazard tree situation. So the next thing we did was we set some goals because we realized we had these problems and we didn't want to miss anything. So we set some guiding goals that would help us to make sure that we were covering everything that we set out to achieve from the beginning. And then from these goals, we divided the course into modules. And so it was a 5-day course overall. So the first thing we did was the basics. We went into what a chainsaw is and how it actually works. And then into the hazard tree mitigation, then into the prescribed fire prep. And then because of popular demand from the folks out there, they wanted to do a little module on direct fire suppression tactics. So how you actually go out there and suppress fire. And mind you, these guys had a lot of prior experience, but they didn't necessarily have that formal training. So that's where we came in to assist. We also really wanted to develop a culture of critical thought and open communication. That's something that I've worked on really hard up here. It hasn't been necessarily a legacy in the fire management world here in the US, and there's a lot of people that are realizing that can be a danger when you don't have people who are feel comfortable talking and bringing up concerns and communicating in a constructive way. And so all of that momentum that's been built here in the US, we tried to bring that down there and impart that on the people that we worked with. We wanted to develop independent thinkers, and unfortunately we didn't allow any robots to enroll in the course. And then finally was incorporating daily reflections and debriefs. And I think that was huge, just getting the feedback from the students, from the staff, figuring out ways that we could do things better day to day, and how to make things better for future if we were given that opportunity. So we'll go into those course goals so you can actually see what the course consisted of. So our first goal was, to me, the most important one. This is primarily the reason why I wanted to start this. I wanted to, myself and the other folks that came down with me, sometimes when you're across a border from somebody and you can't see their face and you just hear fear-mongering on a television set or on a radio, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the people on the other side are individuals, humans just like you and I. And so just the sheer fact of us all coming together across international boundaries, it was an amazing experience, amazing learning opportunity, because people realized, sure, we might be in different countries, but we're pretty much doing the same things. And so that part of the training, to me, I felt was the most invaluable and the most rewarding. And I could see that too in the relationships that we built with all the students and the continuing dialogue that we have even today with all the folks that were involved. So the second course goal was to increase the capabilities of the park staff and the local brigade to efficiently and safely use chainsaws. So once again, we started at a super basic level, and I'm a big fan of like giving people the knowledge on a very basic level of things like how a chainsaw works. So we had a whole section on taking apart a saw, and I'm so thankful to the interpreter that was primarily working with me, a friend of mine named Will Hoff, because he had to describe in Spanish Venturi principle and atmospheric pressure and every single little part of a chainsaw to these students. But it was amazing how fast they were able to take in that knowledge and then to apply it. So when they're out there and their chainsaw stops working, they actually know what's going on in that chainsaw, so then they can use that understanding of science and principles of mechanics to figure out why it's not working and what they need to do to make it work again. And so that was, that's just a microcosm of what this whole training was about, was giving people, not just telling people do this because I say so, but do this, and this is the reasons why I say this. And you should take those reasons and see if they make sense to you, and if they don't, then you need to find your own truth. And so having that approach to the training, I think, built some really amazing independent thinkers and people who are willing to challenge in a constructive way the overall environment that was being created. Okay, so once we got those basic skills down, and now we're able to move into the more complex part of the course, and that was to address the hazard trees. So you could tell, here's another picture of a tree, a nasty tree hanging right over a place where people are going to set up their tents and sit there and camp. And so I mentioned 20,000 visitors to the park a year. About 10,000 of those folks remain overnight. So that's 10,000 people sitting, sleeping, recreating in these campsites day after day for the entire usually warm weather season. And so that puts a lot of risk. And you also got to remember too, so this is at the lower end of that California mixed conifer type. And because of climate change and associated damage to a lot of these trees, there's this large scale mortality event. And primarily it was these white firs. And so a lot of them had died within maybe the past 10 to 15 years. And so you can either wait and you can cut these or let them fall on their own, 20 years from now, 10 years from now, or you can mitigate the hazard now while these trees are not as compromised. So initially when I went up there, the park rangers went around and they said, okay, we have 20 hazard trees, 20 trees that might impact campsites and park infrastructure. So I went up there and I was like, okay, 20 trees. And I went around and I actually counted 60 trees. So these are 60 trees with probably an average diameter of approximately 25 to 30 inches. So that's a pretty big risk. So, we quickly identified that that's a real danger to the park visitors and to the folks that are spending their time up there and enjoying this really amazing resource. So we wanted to progress in a very cautious way. But by the end of the course, we were able to get folks cutting some of these trees under supervision. And so I have a couple videos here that'll help show you guys some of the work we were doing. So you can see, this is some of the park buildings right here. Once again, camp area right there. It's right in the middle of the reception area of the park. So, and then let's see. Then I have another video. So this guy was a firefighter from Tecate, and there's no trees in Tecate, so this is the first large tree that this guy had ever cut down. So you could see, you know, that's the progression over the course. Is this guy who he'd run a chainsaw a lot, you know, cutting chaparral and oak and, you know, small trees, but this is the first time he'd cut a big one. And by the end of the course, you know, he had the skill to be able to safely mitigate some of these hazards. So it was really awesome to be able to watch that progression. Okay, and so then our fourth goal was to increase the probability of successful prescribed fire implementation. And so the way we did that, you know, they had these prescribed fire burn blocks, and they needed to prep the outside of them so that then they could go ahead and put fire on the ground and actually implement their prescribed fire program. And you know, a lot of these folks, they didn't know really what that looked like, because when they fight fire, they go in there with machetes and with their boots and tools, and they fight that fire and put it out. And so they had never done the big box strategy where you go further away from a fire and you prep an area and then put fire on the ground to burn back towards the main fire. And so that was, you know, quite an undertaking to kind of go through that process of critical thinking of like, okay, what vegetation needs to come out here in order for you to be able to safely put fire on the ground and hold this line so that the fire doesn't get out. And these folks picked up on this really fast, and we once again broke up into our two squads, and then we, in classic hotshot crew formation, we worked towards each other for the hard tie-in. And it was really cool to see, you know, once we completed that work, we completed just over a half a mile of heavy deadened down and brush. And when they tied in, you know, they were all super stoked. So it's cool to see that. And, you know, it's important to keep in mind all of this was accomplished over a 5-day period. So then finally, you know, we had a request. We're like, okay, you know, this is our priority. We want to do hazard tree mitigation, basic chainsaw use, how to prepare for the prescribed fires that you guys are going to have to implement. But then we had a bunch of requests of people who were like, wow, you guys seem like you know what you're doing. So can we go out and can we actually like do like fight a fire? And I was like, well, what do you mean by like fight a fire? And they're like, well, we have this land. My grandfather owns a ranch that's like right outside the park. So we can actually like burn some stuff and then get around it, you know, and then catch the fire. And I'm like, well, that might be a little more than we want to get into for this training. But what we did is we went and we put some flagging and kind of made a fake perimeter, about a 1/4 acre fire. And then we broke up into our two squads and we cut around that fire so that we could demonstrate those direct fire suppression tactics. And it was, you know, they said, they were like, you know, I was like, oh, do you want to go do it in the pine up in the high country where, you know, it's pretty easy? And they're like, no, we want to go to the chaparral. So we went down to the chaparral, really thick brush, and we cut in our fire line. And, you know, it was an education for me, because like I said, these guys were talking about using machetes and their boots to break manzanita and to move it out of the way. And they were effective in a lot of ways with the tools that they had, with the resources that they had available to them. And so it was cool to be able to give them, you know, another way of doing things that would put their hard work to better use. And people really got into it towards the end. Going back to our crew mentality, you know, everyone was excited. This is them hiking into that mock fire that we had. So they really, yeah, they really embraced that, and that was cool to see. Okay, so let's do an overview. Let's take a look at our course achievements. So remember, this is over a 5-day period. So the first thing and the most important thing is we trained 17 individuals. And so this goes beyond, I think, just accomplishing objectives. This is giving knowledge that is going to last for years and years to come and hopefully be passed on to other people. So 17 folks were able to complete that 5-day training. And in the process of that, we mitigated 12 hazard trees, and we're talking big trees. You know, that I think the biggest tree that we cut during that training was 50-inch EBH, so that's about this big. And that's not just putting these trees on the ground, but that's also bucking them up and limbing them. And then with all of that material, we were able to provide firewood for park campsites. So most of you have probably seen, but you know, you go to a national park campground even, and within like 500, 1,000 feet in any direction surrounding the campsite, it's just picked clean because people go around and they're ripping branches off of green trees and anything to feed their campfire, right? So now all of a sudden, each of these campsites had a plethora of wood available to them. So once again, going back to our feeding 2 birds with 1 seed, we accomplished that in that situation. We prepared 1 kilometer or 0.6 miles of prescribed fire line. And that might not seem like a lot, but once again, that was done in the course of 1 day, and it met 30% of their targets for prescribed fire prep for the first ever prescribed fire that they will be implementing hopefully this next spring or next year. And then servicing the park chainsaws and giving them the knowledge. And you guys got to remember that these folks are, you know, it's a 2.5 hour to 3 hour drive from Ensenada to the park. And so if something goes wrong with anything in the park, these guys are like MacGyvers. They know how to fix everything, and it's not always the safest or the, you know, the kind of by the book way, but they definitely become jack of all trades because they can't take something into a shop if it breaks until the end of their 13-day assignment. So, so we helped them to have that knowledge where they could keep those chainsaws running out on the fire line. And then once again, the most important part, which was strengthening those international ties, especially in this time of great division. So all in all, very successful, but it doesn't stop here. There's still a lot to be done, and still a lot that needs to be figured out about how to accomplish that. So what are some of the lessons learned? The biggest thing was funding and how much that affects ability to make things happen on the ground. So that's definitely a barrier to progress. So in the future, you know, how do we solve that? You know, and there's two routes that we can go about it, and we're in the process of figuring that out now. But does it make most sense to create a nonprofit organization, organization that we could receive funds that we could then use for future trainings, for future events? Maybe working more closely and figuring out a way that we could make this an official program with the U.S. Forest Service. Or another agency. So a lot that needs to be figured out on that front. In terms of the specifics for future progresses or future projects in the park, there's still a lot of those management targets to complete. So remember, we cut 12 of these hazard trees, and there's 60 that were identified. And that's just trees that are hanging, that are, you know, in campsites or around buildings that are actually leaning towards those areas. So a lot more work that needs to be done there. But it's not just, for us, it's not just, you know, we could go down there and have fun cutting down trees, but we want to make sure that this is something that continues into the future, a trajectory is created that they can address these management problems on their own without us down there, even though we still want to be there. So an idea we had is now we have these graduates from this program. So maybe in the future, folks that come back, they can be mentors. They can act as a senior member of that two-person SAW team, and they can help to develop their own teaching skills and strengthen their own knowledge by teaching that other person that they're working with. And then eventually down the road, maybe those mentors can then become instructors and they can start teaching their own courses. And then finally, we want to maintain this partnership. It's so invaluable, you know, having that dialogue and sharing knowledge. I mean, we learned a ton from them just on how they do things and the experiences that they've had and the challenges that they've faced. And I think that's crucial, you know, for us to come up with solutions in the US. Like, there's already things that I'm thinking about of things that I can do differently in my job based on what I learned from them. So I think that knowledge exchange is really crucial. And then finally, maybe this could serve as a model for other national parks in Mexico, maybe for other developing countries throughout the world. So really the possibilities are limitless. But the model that we created here, I think it's applicable across the board. So we just need to figure out how to make that happen on more of a large scale. Okay, so a lot of people have been asking, you know, as we come back and we digest this, how can we help? So really right now, the biggest thing other than getting people to help out on the ground is insufficient funding. So the biggest thing is the firefighting equipment and the firefighting tools and the equipment. So, you know, a lot of these guys, they're out there, they're fighting fire in jeans. They have hopefully they have a full complement of tools. Remember, one pair of chainsaw chaps. So if you know folks that are, you know, getting rid of old material or organizations that are willing to donate new material, anything like that, these guys would be more than happy to put any of this stuff to use. And it would really increase the ability for them to do their job effectively and safely. And just to illustrate that, so this is a picture that I took in Ensenada, and you can see this is a fire up here just munching through this neighborhood on the hills above Ensenada. And, you know, this was one day when the Santa Ana winds picked up, and I'm sitting there in a coffee shop in town, and I start looking up at the hills around town. And over the course of the day, 6 fires popped up. And they just don't have the resources to fight these fires. And, you know, I think that day 20 houses burned, and they had one helicopter that they borrowed from the National Police Force that was helping to drop buckets on them. And otherwise it was just local people that were volunteering to try to do something about it. So the funding is not there. Their vehicles in the park, you know, they had 2 parked vehicles. Whether they were working at all times is, you know, a different story. And that's super important. If these folks are going to accurately or be able to respond timely to fires and to accomplish all of their work, they need reliable steeds. And then finally, the big thing is just the staff. So remember, we're talking 180,000 acre park, and they have, at any given time, they have 3 rangers that are responsible for patrolling that park. And talking to Felipe, I mean, there's southern ends of the southern part of the park that they've never even been to because they just don't have the time and the resources to go down there. And so, you know, that's going to affect things like they have this, you know, the amazing protection of these tree species. But if they don't have the park staff to be able to enforce this, then, you know, they can have all the laws in the world, but people are just going to come in there and start illegal logging and grazing and everything else. So right now, the only way to give other than resources, other than like equipment and tools, is to donate to Terra Peninsular, and they're the ones that provided a lot of the equipment for the training. So if you want to help out, I would strongly encourage you Terra is a great organization, and we couldn't have conducted this training without them. So with that, you know, this whole process, in terms of the formal presentation, that's it. But I did want to share one final thing with you. And, you know, this whole process has got me thinking. Sometimes I feel a little bit guilty about the work I do. You know, like as a firefighter, you know, on a hotshot crew out there suppressing fires, teaching people how to cut down trees. And I think of things on the bigger picture of, you know, we're facing all these huge challenges like climate change, population, you know, overpopulation in the world, all sorts of things that you could devote your energy to. And sometimes I feel guilty that I'm devoting my time to these tasks that, you know, aren't really a bigger part of the things that are threatening our world. But the more I think about it, you know, I came here and I did a master's degree, and I was involved in the research world, and I wanted to be involved in the bigger picture in that way. But when I was here, I realized that, like, you know, I was able to watch folks like Matt Bowker and Pete Foulée who really loved research and loved doing their job, and they were doing what they loved to do. And just watching these people who were doing something that they were passionate about was inspiring to me. And I realized that research wasn't really what I was passionate about. And so I encourage you, you know, whatever it is that you're passionate about, go out there and do that, and do it 100% and do it with all your heart. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, that thing that you're doing doesn't necessarily have to be the thing that you think is ultimately going to save the world. Because if you're trying to save the world by doing something that makes you miserable, then you're not going to be inspiring to anybody. So just remember that no matter what you're doing, you can do it 100%, and you can do it in a way that inspires other people. And for those of you who haven't seen the recent movie that came out about Mr. Rogers, it kind of got me on this train. And I think that, you know, I'm not the greatest with words, but I think Mr. Rogers is a lot better with it. So I'll let him close out.
He's come to visit several times. There have been families who were getting to us to say that as I was doing my master's work in child development, there was a man who would come every week to scholars, one of the kids, directors, teach. Before or after that, during that time. So a great gift of anything seems to be this is
So on that note, thank you so much for coming and listening to my talk. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah. Oh, thank you.
So you said there's a law that says no putting
Okay, so yeah, so that's a really good question. So what we had to do is they had to put in a petition for each individual tree that we cut. And that's why, 12 was not just a random number. That was the number of trees that they were able to get permission from the government of Baja California to cut. And so they had to document what risk each of those trees presented and why it was necessary to cut that. And that's the only way, is that you have to get an exemption from that law by providing justification of why that tree needs to be cut. So it's, I think it's a gift, and I'm totally happy to work within that if it means preserving this amazing, treasure that they have up there. So, but yeah, it definitely made things interesting. Yeah.
Do you think by getting that permission the next time that happens?
Yes. So I think yes, in terms of the hazard trees in the park, we're already, I've been talking with the park now, and we're going to get that process going so that we can be prepared if we're able to put on another course this coming fall to have all of that ready to go. I just don't want that process to become too easy. So yeah, but that's in the plans for sure.
We can be thankful that I wonder if Cal Fire doesn't get rid of more equipment every year to the whole country of Mexico.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if they do. And I've already, there's a few of the instructors that came down with me last year who are already searching around through the networks of crews that they work in and excess materials and stuff that we could possibly bring down there. So, and conservation corps, there's some local conservation corps that are stepping up to the challenge for us as well. So if there's other organizations that folks know of that are getting rid of stuff or have, things that they need to donate for a tax write-off or anything like that, we would gladly take them and put them to good use. Yeah.
Chris, you said they were going to move forward with some prescribed fire.
Yeah.
Do they have that capability, or are they going to need a bunch of assistance to do that?
That's a good question. So, so most of the fire management that happens in Mexico is done by CONAFOR, which is their version of like our U.S. Forest Service. So, for instance, the burn in the park, that burn plan is administered by CONAFOR, even though it's a Park Service unit. So they, original plan was to do that burn in the fall, but because of all the fires that CONAFOR was dealing with, and with the new change in administration as of December 2018, like CONAFOR's budget was cut by, I want to say like 40 to 50%. And so what that essentially meant is like, that would be as if the U.S. Forest Service here, if one fire season, we just didn't hire any seasonal employees and just the permanent employees fought fire. And so it's kind of been, it's been hard to get the CONAFOR folks to come to the park for the prescribed burn. So that is the hope, is maybe in the future is we can send some folks down there to help with that as well. Yeah. 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 No, that's a really good question. I think just with the nature of this knowledge and the skills, it'd be really hard to do it remotely, but they are finally re-releasing a Mexican, or a Spanish language version of the Wildland Fire Chainsaw course, student workbook. And so that's something, I've been having my finger on that. So as soon as that comes out, I can send copies of that down so that they have like a resource to base off of. And then Will Hoff, the guy I was mentioning that served as the main interpreter for us, he started compiling a bunch of resources. And it was actually kind of a cool journey because we had to put together like a vocab sheet. And we soon realized that there was just words that we use here in fire management in the US that didn't exist in Mexico. So like, for instance, a SAW team is composed of a sawyer and a swamper. So they didn't really have terms for sawyer and a swamper. So sawyer is the one that's cutting with the chainsaw, and the swamper is the one that's pulling the stuff out of the way and directing where the sawyer should go next. And so we were kind of thinking, and we're like, okay, so like in Spanish, and please, someone who speaks Spanish better than me, correct me, but asadero is somebody who is like a swordsman, right? Or a knight. Is that correct? Pete, I'm looking to you on this one. The official translation, I believe, is like a swordsman or a knight. And so we're like, okay, so that's going to be our term for sawyer. And so who's the swamper going to be? So we started thinking, and Will was like, oh, I got it. And he came up with asadero or escudero, which means squire, or like the person that kind of, brings the sword to the knight. And it was funny. So we just like came up with this and wrote it down, and then we're like, all right, let's just start using it. And then by the end of the training, it's like just people were like using it casually, like, yeah, I had really great communication with my escudero today. We're like, cool, started a trend. So, but yeah, we're trying to figure out multiple ways of getting the knowledge down there. So, yeah.
You mentioned that until recently there wasn't grazing and logging.
Yes. So I'm very concerned about that. I'm sure a lot of other folks are. I know two of the gals that attended the training from Terra Peninsular are involved in a study. So they're hoping that they can quantify the effects of that grazing, because right now, like the prescribed fire unit that we were prepping, it's going to be very difficult to get that whole unit to burn, because the fine fuels, all the grasses and stuff, anywhere where there's not like pine needles on the ground, it's not going to burn because it's just been overgrazed. I mean, it's some of the worst grazing that I've seen for a managed, like, government owned, property. And granted, I don't have a lot of experience in developing countries, but it's like indicative of like maybe the worst case Forest Service parcel I've ever seen. So the hopes are that they would, be able to prove that the grazing is having a negative impact on the ecosystem and in turn on the fire ecology of the area, and that they can, limit some of that grazing, if not get it out completely, because I think they're going to be, missing a huge opportunity here if they continue to let that grazing go unchecked.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. And we're going to continue the discussion in room 34A with the graduate student discussion group. And then at 6:30, we're going to go to the Macmillan if anybody would like to join us. Also, Chris will be around all tomorrow in Flagstaff. So if anybody wants to meet and talk more, please reach out to me via my email, and I can put you in touch with him, or we can I can send out an email with his contact. So, thanks so much, Chris.
And one more thing, I just wanted to throw out a plug. Next Thursday, in this very room here, from 6 to 8 o'clock, there will be a Women in Wildland Fire panel discussion that will be going on. So if any of you folks are around or know of people who might be interested in hearing about the experience of women in wildland fire, or are interested in a career in wildland fire, please contact me and I can pass on info on that. We also have a Facebook page going. So there's lots of info out there. But 6 to 8 o'clock, next Thursday, the 12th of March.